trap was perfect. Months of planning, carefully chosen words, witnesses positioned in the crowd. The Pharisees and Herodians, bitter enemies who hated each other, had united for one purpose: to destroy Jesus. And today, in the temple courts of Jerusalem, they would corner him with a question that had no safe answer. One word would end him. Either Rome would arrest him, or the Jewish people would abandon him. It was checkmate. But there was something they didn't know yet. The morning sun cast long shadows across the temple courtyard as Jesus taught. Crowds pressed in from every direction. Farmers, merchants, scholars, the sick hoping for healing, the curious drawn by his reputation. His words cut through religious hypocrisy like a blade, exposing the hollow rituals that had replaced genuine faith. The religious leaders, standing at the edge of the crowd, felt their authority crumbling with every sentence he spoke. That's when they made their move. A group of Pharisees pushed through the crowd, their expensive robes marking them as men of status. But walking beside them, and this was unusual, were Herodians, supporters of King Herod, and by extension, Rome itself. These two groups despised each other. The Pharisees saw the Herodians as traitors who collaborated with pagan occupiers. The Herodians viewed the Pharisees as religious fanatics who threatened political stability. Yet here they stood, shoulder to shoulder, united by a common enemy. And this is exactly where everything changed. "Teacher," the lead Pharisee began, his voice dripping with false respect, "we know that you are a man of integrity. You aren't swayed by others because you pay no attention to who they are. You teach the way of God in accordance with the truth." The crowd quieted. Everyone recognized the setup. Compliments before a trap. The Pharisees' words were weapons disguised as flowers. Jesus stood perfectly still, his eyes moving from face to face, reading the conspiracy written in their expressions. He said nothing. The silence stretched uncomfortably. The Pharisee continued louder now, making sure everyone could hear. "Tell us then, what is your opinion? Is it right to pay the imperial tax to Caesar or not?" The question detonated in the crowd like a bomb. Every Jew in that courtyard understood the brilliance and cruelty of the trap. The imperial tax was the most hated symbol of Roman occupation, a poll tax that every Jewish adult had to pay directly to Caesar, using Roman coins stamped with the emperor's face and inscribed with the words Tiberius Caesar, son of the divine Augustus. Just possessing these coins felt like idolatry. Paying the tax with them felt like worshiping a false god. If Jesus said, "Yes, pay the tax," he would be finished. The crowds who saw him as their liberator, their potential Messiah, would realize he was just another collaborator. Every zealot in the audience, and there were many, would mark him as an enemy. His reputation as a champion of the poor and oppressed would evaporate. The people would abandon him. But if Jesus said, "No, don't pay the tax," the Herodians had witnesses ready. They would report him to Pontius Pilate, the Roman governor, as an insurrectionist. Rome crucified rebels as a matter of routine. Sedition charges required no trial, no evidence beyond a few reliable witnesses. Jesus would be dead within days. You haven't seen the biggest surprise yet. The crowd held its breath. Some people, followers of Jesus, looked terrified. They knew what was at stake. Others, enemies of Jesus, leaned forward with barely concealed satisfaction. They had him. Finally, Jesus let the silence build. 5 seconds. 10. 20. The tension became unbearable. Then he spoke, and his voice carried across the courtyard with perfect clarity. "Why are you trying to trap me, you hypocrites?" The accusation hung in the air. The Pharisees' faces flushed red. Jesus had publicly called them liars, exposed their false flattery, named their scheme in front of hundreds of witnesses. But he wasn't done. "Show me the coin used for paying the tax." But what was truly shocking came next. The request seemed simple, but its implications rippled through the crowd immediately. Jesus didn't have a Roman denarius. He never carried them. They were tools of oppression, stamped with blasphemous claims of divinity. No devout Jew would want to touch them, let alone keep them in their possession in the temple itself. But the Pharisees, these religious purists who condemned others for the slightest deviation from the law, these men who claimed to uphold every letter of Moses' teachings, they reached into their robes without hesitation and pulled out a denarius. The hypocrisy was stunning. They were in the temple, the holiest place in Judaism, carrying pagan coins with graven images of a man who claimed to be divine. They were violating their own standards while trying to trap Jesus for supposedly violating theirs. One of them handed Jesus the coin. He held it up so the entire crowd could see it, the silver catching the sunlight. "Whose image is this?" Jesus asked, his tone almost casual. "And whose inscription?" "Caesar's," they answered. And suddenly their voices didn't sound quite so confident. "What you've seen so far is nothing compared to this." Jesus looked at the coin, then at the Pharisees, then at the Herodians, then back at the massive crowd that had grown even larger as word of the confrontation spread. Merchants had stopped selling. Teachers had stopped teaching. Everyone waited for his answer, the answer that would either destroy his movement or condemn him to death. When he spoke, his words were so simple, so elegant, so devastatingly perfect that the crowd would repeat them for generations. "Give back to Caesar what is Caesar's, and to God what is God's." The effect was immediate and electric. And then, the moment everyone realized what just happened, the Pharisees' mouths opened and closed like fish gasping for air. The Herodians looked at each other in confusion. The crowd erupted in amazed murmurs. Jesus had done the impossible. He had answered the unanswerable question. The genius was in the simplicity. He hadn't said, "Pay the tax," or "Don't pay the tax." He had reframed the entire question. Caesar's image was on the coin. Then it belonged to Caesar's system. Give it back to him. If you're using Roman currency, participating in Roman economy, benefiting from Roman roads and Roman peace, then you're already part of Caesar's system. The tax is just making explicit what's already implicit. But, and this was the devastating part, give to God what is God's. You won't believe what that one phrase meant. Every Jew knew what bore God's image: human beings. Genesis 1:27. God created mankind in his own image. If Caesar's image on a coin meant the coin belonged to Caesar, then God's image on a human meant that human belonged entirely to God. Jesus wasn't just answering a tax question. He was declaring that Caesar's authority was real, but limited to his coins, his roads, his temporary earthly kingdom. But God's authority was ultimate and total. Every human soul, every heartbeat, every moment of existence belonged to the Creator. Pay your taxes if you must, Jesus was saying. Participate in earthly governments if that's required. But never forget that your ultimate allegiance, your soul, your worship, your complete devotion belongs to God alone. Caesar can have his coins. God owns you. The Pharisees couldn't argue with that without denying their own scriptures. The Herodians couldn't report it as sedition because Jesus hadn't told anyone not to pay taxes. Jesus had escaped their trap by ascending above it, by showing that their either-or question was based on a false premise. And this is where the deepest truth emerged. The crowd began to understand. Faces lit up with comprehension. Someone laughed, a genuine laugh of delight at the sheer brilliance of the answer. Then another. Soon the courtyard filled with the sound of people realizing they had witnessed something extraordinary. The Pharisees and Herodians stood frozen, their perfect trap demolished. They had brought their best scholars, their most cunning question, their coalition of enemies united against a common threat. And Jesus had dismantled it all with one sentence. They tried to regroup, to find a follow-up question, some way to regain control of the confrontation. But the moment had passed. The crowd was with Jesus now, energized by his wisdom, amazed by his courage, inspired by his refusal to be intimidated by either religious or political power. One by one, the conspirators retreated, pushing back through the crowd, their faces burning with humiliation and rage. The trap had failed. Worse, it had backfired. Jesus looked stronger than ever. His enemies looked like the manipulative hypocrites he had called them. But there was something darker brewing beneath the surface. As the Pharisees disappeared into the temple corridors, one of them turned back to look at Jesus, still teaching the growing crowd. His eyes narrowed with cold fury. "This isn't over," he muttered to his companions. "If we can't destroy him with words, we'll find another way." They would. In just a few days, they would abandon clever questions and public debates. They would move to secret arrests, false witnesses, and a hasty trial in the dark hours before dawn. They would manipulate Pontius Pilate with threats and political pressure. They would get their crucifixion. But on this day, in this moment, Jesus stood victorious in the temple courts. He had faced down the combined power of religious and political authority with nothing but truth and wisdom. He had taken their weapon, their impossible question, and transformed it into a teaching moment that revealed profound truth about God, Caesar, earthly authority, and ultimate allegiance. What nobody in that crowd fully understood yet was that this confrontation was just a preview. In the coming days, Jesus would face more traps, more conspiracies, more desperate attempts to silence him. And each time his responses would reveal not just intelligence, but something deeper, a clarity about his mission, an unshakable conviction about truth, and a willingness to speak that truth regardless of the cost. The Roman coin sat on the ground where Jesus had dropped it after making his point. Someone picked it up, pocketed it, walked away to spend it. Caesar's image continued circulating through the empire, stamped on millions of coins, funding armies and roads and the machinery of conquest. But God's image, reflected in every face in that crowd, in every person who heard Jesus' words and felt something shift in their understanding. That image couldn't be spent or controlled or taxed. It could only be recognized, honored, and surrendered completely to the one who created it. And on that day, in the shadow of the temple where God's presence dwelled, hundreds of people understood for the first time what it really meant to give to God what was God's. The Pharisees returned to their councils, plotting new schemes. The Herodians reported to their political masters. The crowds dispersed to their homes, carrying the story. But the question remained, echoing through the centuries. What does it mean to give to Caesar what is Caesar's, and to God what is God's? Jesus had answered it perfectly. The world would spend the next 2,000 years working out the implications.